The goal of this section is to spice up your functional programming utility belt with two simple but very useful techniques, currying and partial application. When I first learned functional programming a long time ago, using exotic languages like SML and Haskell, I didn't really understand currying at first glance. This was mainly because the concept appeared in a complicated way, and I believed that it was very complicated. In practice, when approached from the correct angle, currying is indeed a very simple technique. Therefore, you will learn currying and partial application from a practical point of view, hiding most of the complexity from you until you can understand it. We will also heavily focus on the use cases of these techniques so that you will know when to use them. After this introductory section, you will learn the ins and outs of currying in JavaScript, including the benefits of this technique. Our second topic for this section is partial application, or using its other name, partial evaluation. Some people make the mistake of talking about currying when they mean partial application instead. After watching this video, you will not only understand the difference between these concepts, but you will also know which technique should be used and when. We will conclude this section with a practical application of partial evaluation, rendering DOM templates. In this video, we will cover some basic definitions and JavaScript constructs that we will use throughout the rest of the section. We will first define the arity of a function and discover how to retrieve this arity using the length property of functions. We will conclude this video by introducing Variadic Functions and finding out how to handle and how not to handle variable number of arguments in ES6. Let's start with some definitions. The arity of a function is the number of arguments of the function. A function with one argument is called a unary function. The arity of 2 and 3 are referred to as binary and ternary, respectively. In general, an arity of n means that the function has n arguments. There is a way to retrieve the arity of functions in JavaScript. Accessing the length of a function returns its arity. Let's see some examples, including use cases with rest parameters and default arguments, where the arity of a function is not necessarily equal to its proper length. For instance, a function doubling its one and only argument has an arity of 1. Let's define a binary sum function. The length of the sum function is 2. If we bind the first argument of sum to 5, we have one argument left in the bound function, yielding an arity of 1. When using default arguments, the length of a function equals the number of arguments before the first default value. This is why the length of this strange function is 1. Don't rely on the length property in case of using rest parameters in the argument list. Some args has a length of 0, even though some args has a variable number of arguments. Talking about variable number of arguments, functions with a rest parameter have a special name. They are called Variadic Functions. There is absolutely nothing special with this name. Just bear in mind that you should rely on rest parameters to access the arguments. Recall the SumArgs function. Technically, you could implement it using the arguments object. This was your only option in ES5. You could think that we can call the reduce method on arguments to return the same value as the arrow function. However, when calling SumArgs2, we get an error saying that reduce is not a method of arguments. This is because even though arguments looks like an array, it is not an array in practice. In order to make the SumArgs2 function work, we have to make arguments an array. The usual trick is to use the slice method of the array prototype on the arguments that will not only make a shallow copy of the properties of arguments, but it will also make it an array. If you call SumArgs2 with these arguments, you can see that the function is working as expected. We just went through a couple of simple definitions. You now know what the arity of a function is, and you also know how to retrieve it by querying the length of a function. Don't forget that you should use rest parameters to handle variadic functions.